Yeah, hi everyone, welcome. Ben, thank you so much for doing this. We're really excited to hear a little bit more about your career path, and then those students who are out there and interested in possibly getting into finance or intersections of finance. This is definitely a great conversation to listen in on, and hopefully you have some questions during it that you can direct towards the Dory. But Ben is calling in from Austin and has experience working in finance as a manager and head of finance at Google and Moonshot, and is currently VP of finance at Care.com. So really looking forward to hearing sort of how you get into these roles, and then what our students and what college students around should be sort of be focusing in on if they are interested in sort of a similar career trajectory. So with that being said, Ben, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy to be here. I think this is a great platform, and Chris and the team have done some pretty cool stuff. I won't get too much into my background because I'll walk you all through it, but I will say, like, I followed a little more traditional path into finance where my undergrad degree was in finance, but I've worked with many people who have come through different paths. And actually, if I could go back and do it again, and I'll talk about this a little bit, I probably would have done an engineering degree and then even gone into finance because it's becoming quite a technical field. But I think you can come from really anywhere, and if you have an interest in it and a passion, it could be an entry way into finance. So I'm actually hiring for some finance analyst roles. So this was like an easy exercise of like what I'll look for, and what the role kind of encompasses. So sort of the basics of like what an analyst at a company does, and there's different parts of finance. Like I'll get into it, but I started my career on a different side of finance in the investing world, but at a company is kind of what I'll talk about today. There's sort of this, what I call the wheel that we go through every month. So we forecast what's happening in the business. We're tracking to budgets. We're doing planning once a year or once a quarter, or depending on the company. But these are sort of the lifeblood of a company. So you're holding your partners accountable to what their plans were, the plans you built with them, and this could be in many different areas. And it's good to understand this stuff as well. Like even if you go into marketing, like James said, he was studying, you're going to partner very closely with the finance team, and you're going to help. And it'd be good to understand like why certain numbers are important or milestones. You see finance analysts in many different areas. Like we currently at Care, we have a corporate kind of central team that does a lot of the consolidation, works with HR. We do headcount forecasting, and then I've got different business units across our different product areas. And you'll see this within bigger companies like a Google as well. You have sort of these corporate central teams. You have sales, finance teams that work with different sales organizations and set quotas for the sales teams and help drive the business to achieve goals. You know, sort of outside that normal flow of every month of how are we tracking versus budget? What does the forecast look like, which will help inform decisions at the most senior levels. You're also a key partner and really sometimes the owner of defining the key metrics and KPIs that drive a business. And what I found throughout my career is like, depending on what metrics you have a business and your team focus on, you can actually change the behavior of people and what they're developing from an engineering standpoint or a product standpoint, or how the sales team is operating. So these are really critical areas that the finance team has very, very high influence over. You know, sort of the biggest area I think is overlooked, and this is even at entry level roles, is you have to partner across functions. You need to work very well with your peers, and actually often what I find is you'll see finance team members working with very, very, very senior people in the organization, and it's a great opportunity to do that, but across many different areas. So the stronger you can build like internal relationships, often the more effective you can be, even if somebody might be more technical or understand business a bit better. If you can kind of build these relationships, you'll often perform better. So what kind of skills do you need to be successful? You know, when I look to hire like a more junior person, actually my thoughts on this have changed over the last few years. I definitely am like skewing towards the more technical folks. So I feel like if I bring in someone who knows how to do SQL or R, Python, and doesn't quite know, what business metrics would be important, I'd actually rather teach them, how to understand the business side, because I can't. It's much harder for me to teach somebody how to be technical. But I certainly like a basic understanding of like how P&L works, how it interacts with other financial statements, because we are making decisions on a day-to-day, sometimes at a product level, in order to optimize these aspects of the business. Because ultimately that's how we talk to our investors, our executives, and our board is like through the financial numbers. The ability to build complex financial models, leveraging Excel, Google Sheets on top of any of the analysis you can do in SQL, super important. You want things to be accurate. The biggest thing you can do is do work that's accurate and timely and deliver on goals to your manager and to your team, because that will help build your trust. And again, if you go back to what I said in the last slide, the more you can like nail those basics of like your forecast and your budget, the more and the more you can automate it through using SQL or different systems, the more time you'll have to actually really drive the business and focus on the KPI and the strategic areas. Communication, this is something that is super critical, not just for you and your partners, but you and your manager and your manager's manager. Often you'll see a lot of copy, meaning a lot of words in slides or emails, and it's very hard. Like, you want to get your point across, and I understand why people do it, but then you have to think on the other side of the coin, where your manager or your CMO who you're working with on a project probably getting 100, 200, 300, 400 emails a day. So the easier it is to digest your information, the more value you'll add, actually. And it's always fine to have like all the backup ready, and that's actually good for deeper questions. But how do you deliver your message in a really crisp way, I think is super critical. And then prioritization is very important. And I think when you come in an entry-level role, it's really hard to know what is the most important thing. So don't be afraid to ask your manager. Don't be afraid to ask your manager to help you say no to things. I think that's probably the biggest lesson I learned at Google, is like, I came in and I wanted to please everybody, and then I just ended up doing poorly on everything because I just had too much work. So how do you prioritize? How do you know what the most critical is? And often you'll have to learn that over time. So don't expect to do that right away, but have that be the opening of every time you meet with your manager, or you can do it on Slack or whatever now, where you're making sure you're aligned and working on the most important thing. One thing as I move to this next slide is, and those are sort of the basics. And again, like I'm going to walk through my career, but happy for anyone to reach out to me on any channel, LinkedIn, to if you have questions. I think finance is often like an overlooked role, as many of these other roles are, because if you read the press and you read books about technology companies, you'll only really hear about the engineers or the founder, and that's true. They do all the hard work, but like one of the things that made me feel really good actually was the co-founder of my last company, where I was the CFO, which was Chronicle. He posted this on LinkedIn at some point during our when we were operating as a company, and he was a longtime Googler, and actually didn't think we needed to hire any of these other roles. And seeing him evolve over a couple of years while working together with a competent team was really like a very fulfilling moment for me, to say he could see the value, right, that like these other functions bring. And I think finance is right there. And especially when you're working with companies that are looking to raise capital, are looking to launch new products and new business models, the finance team is often there helping design that stuff, and it's all very critical. And then operationally, how do you scale a company? These are all things that you need to focus focus on. So that's a really high level overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own path, and that will kind of lead into like kind of what I look for when I look to hire folks. But I think that my like experience is probably something that hopefully you'll take something away that's a positive, and as you think about your own career. So I've had I'm approaching 20 years almost of working. I started my career on the investing side. I spent almost a decade there. I moved over to Google, which was really like a huge culture change for me and a really exciting experience. Sorry, my phone is ringing. So everything's integrated now. So my Gmail rings when my phone rings. I went to Google X to work on some of their moonshots. I was part of a company that spun out of Google X into an independent Alphabet company. And then we were acquired back into Google, which is quite an interesting story. And then now I'm at Care. But sort of the key message that I'll deliver to you guys is that your plans will change. So whatever, if you map out a 5-year plan, just like a company, like 3-4 months later, you might scrap it and redo it. And you guys just need to be flexible around that. And you can still keep your goals and move towards them, but everything will change kind of over time. So one of the things that like you have to maintain and actually will help yourself throughout your career when you're interviewing, when you're working, is to really have that confidence and belief in yourself. That's a message that my father always gave me. I always thought he was silly, but I think it's something that's really true, right? Like when you move to a new company or a new job, like there's always going to be that point in the beginning where you feel like you're not contributing or you're lost, and all these people know all this stuff that you don't. Well, don't forget they've been there for quite a bit of time, and you're there for a reason, and you have to keep that self-belief. And I think that's really, really, really critical, and something I would keep in mind. And I remind myself of that all the time, right? Throughout my career, even though I've had some success, like there are points where I felt lost or confused on what I wanted to do. And I think that's it's way more common than I realized. I read a LinkedIn study that I think it was 75% of 25 to 33-year-olds experience with something like a quarter-life crisis. And often it's related to they're at like a crossroad in their career, where I've run into my own frustrations and things I've learned is, you can't compare yourself to other folks. Not everyone will be, a Mark Zuckerberg, or you may have friends that have different trajectories than you, but everyone's moving at their own pace, right? It's just like if you're running a race, like you just do the best that you can, and you can't compare yourself. The other thing is what I found has helped me is you always like keep learning and keep investing in yourself. Some of the points in my career where I felt the most lost is actually when I took a step back and invested in myself the most. I was talking with Jen about I went to NYU for business school. That was at a really hard time for me. I was working at a hedge fund in the middle of the last financial crisis in 2008, but I forfeited, I made sacrifices and forfeited my personal life, and went to school at night and on the weekends. I invested more in myself after that, and went through the CFA exam, which was quite grueling after I completed my degree. But it was all about investing in myself and making sure, like, even though I maybe wasn't the most happy at work, that I was trying to do things to make myself more valuable in future. So, get to maintain that open mind, always want to be learning. There's no playbook, for anything. And you'll have different levels of success at different points, and success can be defined differently at different points in your life as well. Like, I've got a young family now, and things, what you think about and what your priorities will shift. So what you think is important now probably won't be, 10 years from now. One of the things that I've when I was thinking through this that I found, like, kind of amusing was I was trying to map my career to like what has happened in the stock market. And part of this is to show you like, sometimes luck is involved, but like my timing has been really bad. But my plans have changed throughout this, right? Like I went to undergrad and I thought I was going to be like an orthopedic surgeon, right? Like I always had been an athlete. I always had injuries and broken bones. I thought it'd be really cool to help people do that. I was on the golf team in college, and a teammate of mine came back my freshman year to a practice, and this was like in the tech bubble in the late '90s, and mentioned how I think it was Bear Stearns, I don't remember which one. It was one of the banks that don't exist anymore, but they offered him like this huge signing bonus straight out of school with a big salary, working in banking. I took a step back and said like, wow, I can get a job really quickly and make a bunch of money and not have to go to medical school. So I went and changed my major, right? So like I shifted from doing, pre-med to I went into financial economics. And it was pretty quickly, and it was a decision that looking back is probably was the right call, but it was a pretty, when you're 18, 19, you make those decisions pretty quickly. And that was at the peak when I made that decision. By the time I graduated in 2002, it was actually the middle of a recession. The tech bubble had burst. The economy was pretty bad. There weren't a lot of jobs for new grads, and it was a tough time. I had secured an internship at a value investing firm. I'm from the Bronx in New York, and there's a famous investor from there, Mario Gabelli, from the same neighborhood, and I had written him like an actual letter. So when you put it in the mail and mail it about getting an internship, and it worked. So I worked there for a couple summers, and I was lucky enough to get a job there. It was a very like old school environment, but it was a great place to kind of start my career and learn some stuff. One of the things a lesson I'll impart on you guys was like the stuff I was doing in my first job. I remember this is the very, very first, year or so. I was like making sure numbers matched. I was recording stuff on a phone. It was stuff that I was like, I can't believe I went to college for this. But it was all about like learning how to work with people and identifying the stuff that got me excited. But there will be points when you go to your first job where you'll probably be doing stuff that you didn't, is very easy or not that exciting. But again, it's all part of a process. It was actually funny. I opened up LinkedIn one day, and that's Mario, who I worked with for a number of years. And I was one of his favorite people to do this to. But you can see like cultures are super different, right? Like the culture of a company will often be defined by the leaders, and that's what works, and certain things work in certain scenarios. And Mario's message in this video that was on LinkedIn was like, he always yells at people, and that's true, and that's different than Google. But you have different people in different environments, and there's things you can take away from that. And it was a great opportunity. He ended up giving me a lot of responsibility, but again, my plans changed after that. I joined a hedge fund, essentially at the top of the market before 2008. Again, timing is interesting. It was a really exciting opportunity. But at the same point, I was a little nervous about like what I was doing. At that point, I was a trader. There was a lot of trends that continued towards like algorithmic trading, dark pool liquidity platforms, which would make what I did less valuable. And even though I had this like exciting new big job, I wanted to keep myself viable in the future. And this point is actually when I started to go to school at night. So again, having to make sacrifices, but I wanted to be more analytical. I wanted to move towards the research side. And then I also wanted to give myself optionality, which I think is important for all you guys to think about. Like, how do you keep optionality in like the industries you work with and your skill set? So, in order for you to achieve your goals later on. And I felt a little constrained in the investment space where I could only work in New York and I could only work in London, and there's like a certain number of firms. So I felt like this was a good decision for me personally. So after, switching to another firm, getting through the financial crisis, actually had a job where I was managing, multiple billions of dollars in this like passive strategy. I've been recently promoted. I was working on interesting research projects, but my plans changed, and I felt like I could be, doing more. And I was 12 years into this career. I had put everything into, but I wanted, I had this feeling where I was missing part of the equation. Like I didn't really understand how a company operated. I knew how to make a company look good in a spreadsheet, but I didn't know how like the guts of it worked. And I was lucky enough to get an opportunity to move over to Google. And partially that was from that desire to go and learn how companies worked. And then even within Google, I made some entrepreneurial, I call them entrepreneurial decisions to move from like the core business over to Google X, which is the moonshot factory, work on some really cool stuff like flying wind turbines at this project called Makani, and then ultimately, help build a company called Chronicle, which was operating as an independent company within Alphabet and then eventually back. But one of the things I want to take away from like how I got my job at Google, and I think you guys will feel this way too, often when you look at job descriptions, is like I had nothing that they were looking for, like literally nothing. I remember this was all the stuff on the job description. I ended up finding it in some of my files. I had the MBA, but literally nothing else. So, how do you get a job when you don't have any of these skills? Well, part of it was like, one, identifying gaps that you can fill. So I didn't know how to work with SQL. I'd never even heard of it before. I ended up taking a class at night in the city and learning at least some of the basics so that during the process, I could like show them how serious I was about this. And it actually helped me when I actually got the job. I believed in myself that I could do the job, and that came across, I think, in the interviews. And that helped shape the perception of the folks that I was talking to. And just like, what I actually advise against, like setting up a checkbox for your career, it can be really intimidating to look at a job that you're dreaming about and see all the gaps that you don't have. And I actually get excited about jobs where I don't have, where I don't fit or check all the boxes. And those are the ones that I gravitate towards, and I encourage you all to kind of keep that attitude as well. You want to make sure the key areas to evaluate, right, are culture, which is very hard to do, but you can get, maybe someone that works there, or you can ask certain questions. And make sure you're challenging yourself, right? Like again, the first job might not be that way, but if you focus on the right stuff. One of the things I did at Google, which I think again was a little bit against the grain, was like I didn't focus so much around the near-term promotion or the performance review process that they had there. And I thought a little bit longer term about the decisions that I made. So like when I left the main Google, went to Google X, I actually probably forgone a promotion and so managing a big team to go to this project within X that was very small. But I felt like it was a good decision if I looked multiple years out and was optimizing to get a different set of skill sets. And then just for fun, my most recent change was leaving Google. It was in early March, right into the middle of the pandemic. I really loved what we were doing at Chronicle. I believed in our mission. I was excited about it. But my plans changed. From an Alphabet standpoint, it made sense for Chronicle to be part of Google, and I decided not to stay and do something else within Google and take a new challenge. And I'm lucky enough to be at care.com, where a newly acquired company within IAC, which is a company started by Barry Diller, a tech holding company. But again, when I first left, the world was blowing up. And it was easy to get anxious around it, but I believed in myself and the value I could bring to companies, and I felt like an achievement to land it's an exciting role during a crazy time in the world. Where one of the things I took away from Mario, actually, he wrote this in one of his books, I believe, where he used to talk about it all the time, was, not only you have to believe in yourself, and remember that your plans will change, but what I think about myself and when I think about when I hire people are, Mario told me this once, he's like, I only hire PhDs. And I'm like, well, I don't have a PhD. And he's like, it's not academic, but it's sort of a mindset of being poor, hungry, and driven. And I think bringing that mindset to work every day will only, make you all more successful. I don't know where I'll be in 5 or 10 years. I don't know, who knows, but I'm excited about it, and I like to keep trying to figure it out, and I like to go to companies, and I like to solve problems, and hopefully you all can kind of follow in those same paths. And again, I think it's sort of an uncertain time now, and it reminds me a bit of a lot of what I've gone through, but again, staying confident, networking the right way, finding opportunities, and not being scared of looking at jobs, making sure they're geared towards like more entry-level roles, certainly, but like don't be scared away by the fact that you don't check every box. And I think that's the key message I would have for you all. I'm happy to do some Q&A at this point. I want to leave plenty of time for that.
Awesome, Ben. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed this this presentation, and sort of hearing about your career and how it. I love the graph with how it ebbed and flowed with the different what was going on in the market. I think that's
well, it's always bad timing on my part. So.
Well, no, it's helpful to see, and I mean that's something that I think a lot of students are facing right now, given
for sure,
given COVID, and it's a pretty uncertain time, similar to what you were facing during the crash. So I see the Dory now. There's actually a question on that, which is what advice do you have for students in the COVID era, given the amount of uncertainty similar to your position during the market crash?
Yeah, I mean, I think my advice is like, start early and often, right? Like what I was, I focused on trying to, I had plenty of friends who didn't work during the summer, right? Like when I was an undergrad, and they had a lot of fun, and they did, and that's great. Like, and I did fun stuff too, but I always wanted to make sure like I had, whether it was an internship or I was, working towards something, which ended up creating a job opportunity for me. And I think it's actually quite interesting now how digital everything is, and there's probably opportunities to do stuff, like James is doing here, right? Like where he's helping out Xoogler School. I think there's opportunities to help companies on certain projects or do virtual internships. And I know it's hard because you can't be there in person, and meeting people does have a lot of value. But certainly, building your network, don't be afraid to do that either, right? Like, I think that's one thing some people are afraid to say, like, oh, my parents happen to know somebody. Like, that's okay, right? Like that's part of how things are done, or how you meet people, or someone that knows someone. Like, try to get these introductions. People are often more willing to help, or at least give advice, than you realize. I'm a big believer in karma. So I'm always open to make introductions. I actually enjoy doing that quite a bit, or identify opportunities. And the thing is, like, if you meet someone and you impress them, they may not have something for you today, but 6 months from now, like they could see an opportunity, and because you made a good impression, you can pop to the top of their head, and they'll make that connection.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it, getting these introductions, and thank you for the offer to connect with students. I think that's huge, especially during times like these. I love that you sort of believe in the karma and that it comes around. So thank you. And let me look at our next sort of question here, which is from Lauren. And the question is, could you go into more detail of applying to jobs, even if you don't meet most of the qualifications? How do you advocate for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's always certainly the first hurdle, which is like, how do you get a conversation? And you know, when you're if you're just spraying and applying on websites, like often you'll be filtered out. So that's where somewhat of a warm introduction I think is helpful. And again, like you guys are early in your careers and your networks probably are not as robust, but you probably know someone who knows someone who works at almost every company, right? Like there's that 6 degrees of separation, or maybe not every company, but a large amount of them. So, or maybe there's an alumni from your school who happens to work there. So the warmer that first pass can be, the higher the probability of you getting that opportunity to have a live conversation. And that will give you the chance to advocate. Like it's not going to work all the time because you know, there's plenty of jobs I applied to that I never heard back from. Like I got ghosted by a recruiter. Like this stuff happens still, right? Like to this day. So don't think there's something wrong with you or anyone else if that happens. Like it still happens to me. It happens to people I work with who are very senior. But again, the warmer those introductions are, again, the more likely you can have a conversation, and that's when you get the opportunity to impress somebody. And every conversation you have is an interview too. Like don't forget that either, right? Like whether you're talking to a recruiter, somebody who works at a company, like think of it that way. Doesn't mean it has to be formal. Like the more formal and scripted things are, the less real they are. Like you can be yourself, but just don't forget, like most of these conversations will feed into like, oh, do I want to recommend this person, right? Or put them in front of somebody.
Awesome. This is not a question, but it is humorous. Someone asked, let us know when you plan on changing jobs or going back to school. So far, it's been a great year.
I make that joke all the time, actually. So maybe I'll start a blog or something like, hey guys, I'm leaving, go short the market.
Yeah, I would absolutely follow. So let me know if you do, and I'll be on it. A question here, which is how and why did you make the switch from investment banking to Google?
Yeah, so you know I was actually on the buy side, like equity investing, and I got off the phone with a CEO of a company who we were investors in, and oftentimes as investors, you're advocating for either a change in the business or them to focus on an area that you feel is either more profitable or has higher growth potential. So I got off the phone with the CEO. I remember the call like not going that well. He was sort of dismissive of what I said. And I got home at night and it's kind of these like self-reflection moments. And you're like, well, why would this, we're a relatively large investor in this company. Like, why wouldn't he want to listen to what I had to say? And, what I thought back to was like, well, it's probably because like whatever I was telling him, like he already looked at and said no to, or I just didn't understand like how you go and do these things or how hard it is, right? On a spreadsheet, it's really easy to take a number and say like, well, that times 30% growth looks way better. When you're operating a company, it's like really hard actually to like, how do you scale and like, how do you bring people on and have them be productive in a timely manner and like train them and onboard? And I didn't understand like that side of the coin. I remember thinking about all the people I work with and looking at the folks on the investment team. Like, no one had ever worked on the other side of that I had ever worked with. So I wanted to get that experience of like operating a company, and I felt one, like if I ever went back to investing, I'd actually be a better investor because I'd know better questions to ask and what to look for in the management team. And I think that's actually true. And I had a desire to like, not just have a thesis about a company and then see if it worked or not within a 6-month period and move on to something else. Like I wanted to like really focus on helping grow something.
Let me see here. Another question sort of on filling those gaps, but this is in terms of an interview. So the question is, in the interview process, how do you approach the argument that you can fill the gaps? How can you appropriately react if the interviewer is not interested?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's certain, it's kind of like dating, like some go well and some don't, and you kind of know when they don't. There's occasions where it won't go well. I think, where you can try to change, the tone of the conversation is probably the most powerful part. Like, one of the things that when I was leaving Chronicle that, came up in a number of conversations was, well, you've never gone and like raised a round, right, for a company. And, I got like, you have to think, like, I thought of these things ahead of time, right? Like, that's the other thing is like, know ahead of time the questions that you'll probably get. And I had a good story about like why I felt like that was true, but less of a crutch for me. Personally, it had to do with some of the stuff we'd done at Alphabet and my own experience as an investor. But like, you can kind of know looking at yourself and looking at a job where those gaps might be. And I think it's like having a good story, because again, you're selling yourself and you're telling a story about yourself around that, knowing you're expecting some of these questions. And if you notice that some of these gaps are continually coming up, then how do you address it, right? And like, there's plenty of opportunities to put time in and address them, or proactively, offer up your skill set to, even if it's a small business, to try to solve these problems that may come into play later. But I think that will show like that, the PhD in you, right?
Awesome. That's super helpful. Let me see here. Okay, this is a good question. What is the best way to gauge what type of company culture works for you? In your experience, what are the red flags?
Yeah, I think it's hard because like different people excel in different cultures, right? There's positive and there's going to be positives and minuses around all these companies. Certainly you want to go, especially early in your career, to a company that offers the opportunity, and you have to do it in a very, you kind of ask these questions in a structured way, because you don't want to say like, hey, all right, I'm going to come in and be this analyst, but then what can I do in 3 years? But like, how do they invest in developing you, right? Like, you can ask around like their learning and development platform. Like, a lot of companies are investing heavily in that, which means like they're offering courses, and some companies partner with companies like Udacity or whatever to offer these learning opportunities to better their own employee base. So how do they invest in their employees? How do they think about like, performance management, and what does success look like? If it's a more public facing company, like, read up on the leadership, right? Because that will often set the tone of what the culture can be like at a company, because it does come from the top, and often the culture is set like pretty early in life. Within that first 100 people, the things that matter, or the precedents of like things that happen, get set. So like, what are those early, if they're still around, if it's a smaller or mid-sized company. And then again, if you can find people that have worked there and understand, what it's like. Some of these like online review systems can be a bit dangerous, right? Like Glassdoor, like some of them are true, but like you'll usually only get the outliers that post on there. I mean, certainly if there's like hundreds of like bad reviews, that's a pretty big red flag. But if there's like one or two, sometimes you gotta like understand like who's posting and why. But those can be interesting tools to at least do some research about. And if you see like high turnover, that's obviously a red flag. So executive level high turnover, that can usually be a bad sign, because they'll know more than most other people. So if people come in and out, like if you see C-level folks like churning every 6 months or something, like look at, I don't want to name any companies, but some of them, you see this happen sometimes, that can be a red flag as well. But yeah, from your own experience, like you're going to have to experience a few different, like I've worked in many different cultures. Care is way different than Chronicle. Chronicle, we tried to identify our own culture, which was a little different than Google X and a little different than Google, but took some parts of that. Working in investing was very different than any of those. So, but there's good and bad that you want to take. And then actually, as you get further along, you can kind of try to shape the culture of your own team in a way that takes the best of everything you've experienced.
absolutely. I think everyone is going to have to experience, especially young careers. There's going to be a lot of different cultures, like you're saying.
Yeah, and like I think sometimes, there's good parts of like what can be considered a tough place to start a career, like investment banking. Like there's a lot of, it's hard for a couple of years, but there's a lot you take out and that's valuable for the rest of your career. So sometimes like that's why you see a lot of people like go and do it for 2 years and go do something else, because they're like, it's a springboard to many other things. And I'll suck it up for a couple of years, but not a lot of people stay, right? Like for many, many years. So you have to think about it sometimes in that context too, like will you get some skill out of it that will be valuable, even if it's, it's a short-term trade.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. What is your view on the future of algo trading and HFT? Do you see it posing any ethical dilemmas?
Wow. Well, I'm many years removed from that. I think, that's a complex problem. It's kind of like they pick off pennies from folks, and I don't know if ethically I see anything. There's argument on both sides. They provide liquidity and they are taking advantage of folks, but I don't have a very strong point of view on that. I do think like it will be interesting to see as more and more, like if you look at a trend of like assets into passive investing, what happens with some of these big moves. Does everything just move together? I'm kind of interested to see if we have a correction, like does more of that single stock mindset come into play, or is it just so shifted now that everything just is correlated? That's more of a personal interest.
Thank you. From this question from Julia, and that is, could you talk more about how to make yourself stand out in a finance role within a company once you have the job? And what can help work your way up other than through experience? So I think once you're within a company, you sort of stand out to the finance side.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly like identifying, the early wins are process gaps. So like, where is there like a super manual process that could be automated with some investment? I think those areas, like when I have folks that come in and say like, hey, I just automated this thing that we used to spend a week on and now it takes 5 minutes. Like that's a huge win, right? And like somebody, and it's not someone that like the proactivity to do that, right? So it aligns with like making sure you're working on the prioritized items. But if you're doing all that stuff, like how do you find efficiencies? I think the folks, again, I'll go back to that partnering aspect. Like there's nothing better than hearing good things about your team from other portions of the business. So, one thing, like sometimes I'll remind other folks who are newer into like an operating finance role is your team works for you, but they also work like across the company. So you want those people that work really well with other areas. And then early on, it's just, don't be afraid to ask questions and be hungry and learn new things. You can sit in on meetings. You can, take work that's been done and try to understand it, because I think all of that is like deposit. So the more somebody's like proactively trying to learn and investing in themselves, like I know they're going to be a valuable member of my team and someone that I want to keep around and help grow. So I think it comes back to the attitude that you bring to work. If you're just going to go and do the same process that somebody else did before you, and then clock out, like that's not going to make you stand out. Like you're going to inherit usually some work process. How do you improve it? How do you identify areas of like either savings or opportunity, depending on what you're working on? And how do you partner across the business? And those are ways to stand out. And being reliable too, right? Like if you have a deadline, sometimes you're going to miss them and that's fine, but like be upfront and say like, hey, like a couple days before, like, hey, we talked about this on Friday, but it's probably going to be Monday or Tuesday. Like that communication too is really important.
Definitely. Thank you. A question here, more generally, in your opinion, why is the market so hot right now?
Personal opinion. I mean, a lot of it has to do with like perpetually low interest rates and stimulus packages, right? Like it's not fundamentally driven. Most people can go outside and see the economy is not what it normally is, let alone, you know, in a growth phase. And there's tons of people out of work. You know, so I think it's mostly policy driven personally. So which makes, you know, you wonder how long you can keep that going. Although we've been doing it for 10 years. So.
Right. Question here from Tamara, which is, can you speak about the most recent person you hired or participated in hiring and what stood out about them to you, especially if they were a recent grad?
Let's see. Yeah, I mean, this had like a recent grad. It would have to go back a couple years. Hired like a staff accountant. I'm actually looking at some more junior analyst roles now, but probably not for like straight out of school. So for her, she had spent like a year or two at like a big four accounting firm, and had picked up like a, yes, it's almost like the accounting equivalent of like doing investment banking, but she had picked up a nice variety of skills from the fact that they engaged with different types of companies, which was perfect for what I was looking for because I was a hybrid startup within a large public company. So some of that like variety and experience that she had garnered was very interesting. And then she was really curious about stuff, right? Like actually after working for me, she's now a financial analyst, largely data driven. And that was actually a skill set that she had interest in. And we actually trained her on it and helped her learn it. And then it helped her automate some of our accounting processes. And then she found something she was really passionate about and was able to change her career path out of accounting and into a finance analyst role. But again, you know, when I met with her, you know, and again, she wasn't like, her personality wasn't, you know, the loudest person in the room. She was very quiet, but like you could tell she was going to work hard and she had interest in beyond of just what she was doing and getting the job done. And I think that's what helped her stand out. So you can be yourself, right? And she was a quiet person, but you gotta make that come out like on your own personal drive.
Yeah, great, thank you. Question here, which is, if you could go back in time to the moment you finished undergrad, what advice would you have given? What advice would you give yourself? Would you do anything differently in your career journey?
Change my timing. No, yeah, no, I think like there's probably been a couple times where I've gotten like a little too anxious. I mean, I do find like once I start like thinking about what I could do next and looking at jobs that usually I'm done. You know, I wonder what I'd be doing if I'd stayed at sort of the first company I was at, because I, you know, had a nice trajectory there. I went from like back office to the trading floor to doing stuff for billions of dollars. But I was very early in my career and I just wanted more sooner. So sometimes there is like, you know, the benefit in being patient and building a lot of goodwill in one place, as long as you're getting that varied opportunity. Like you'll often see this in some executives where they spent, and I'm not advocating for one way or the other, but I worked with people who were very senior who like the first 20 years of their career were essentially rotations within like a bigger company. And then they branched out and did other stuff. So I just wonder like what that would have looked like. Otherwise, like, yeah, I mean, you can always look back and say like, well, that wasn't the optimal decision, but I think, you know, playing like Monday morning quarterback can be dangerous. If I look back at like the moment in time, I like to think I at least have made like well-informed decisions at that moment. Like it's easy to look back and say like, ah, that was a mistake. I should have taken with this other job opportunity. But I think in the moment, like as long as you feel like you've done your due diligence, you're making the best decision you can with the given information you have, You got to just run with it and be happy. And then you can get other opportunities which will arise. Sometimes they're organic, again, by like creating networks and talking to people. And sometimes you're actively out there looking for stuff.
Thank you. Definitely solid advice. Let me see here. Can you go into more depth about the ways you made yourself more marketable to jobs that you didn't meet the minimum qualifications for? How did you identify the gaps you could fill for these companies, and how did you market that?
Yeah, so like if I think about even Chronicle, right? Like, so that was a project within X. It was pretty small, but they hired this a really seasoned C-suite executive. He came over. He had prior been the COO at Symantec, and I worked very closely with him early on. And he was telling me how he was going to build out his leadership team. And we went and hired like a CMO who had done this many times with security companies. We hired a chief revenue officer who had helped take a company public, and from 100 million in revenue to $1 billion, a very experienced general counsel. And then he would show me like who he was going to hire as a CFO, right? Like, and this was a very long process. So this wasn't like an interview, but it kind of speaks a little bit to it. Like he was like, I'm going to hire this CFO from some public company in this one. And I'm like, well, I was like, don't forget about me. So ultimately, like I worked with him very closely for over a year, and I took a risk. Like I told him what I thought. Sometimes you have to take a risk, right? Like I went to him and I said, look, this is what I think the finance team needs to look like to achieve our goals, including some other stuff. And I said, like, here's what it could look like. Personally, given what I've done for you, like I don't want any other role than the CFO role, and I'm willing to walk away from this if I didn't get it. And again, like there's a risk to it. And he, kind of joked with me and said, like, you already had the job, I just didn't tell you. But like I had to do this Jerry Maguire speech. I don't know if anyone here has seen that movie, but sometimes you got to take a risk and go for what you want and believe in yourself, right? It goes back to my message. Like when I was interviewing for the Google role, then I had to think about like, how do I frame what they want me to do in this job relative to what I've done before. So you could think of it as like, well, you don't have any digital media experience and you've never worked with this sales team globally. And I tried to reframe the whole job around like what I knew, which is like, how do you manage a portfolio? How do you spot trends? How do you do financial model? Like the stuff I knew I could do right away, and I'd learn the rest of it while educating myself as much as possible on the industry and understanding that. So if you're really passionate about a job or a company, like there's a plethora of information out there, and like inform yourself as much as possible so like what's happening or in that company and in that industry. Like you'd find it amazing how many times like at Google, one of the questions sometimes they had us or they said you should ask sometimes is like, how does Google make money? And a lot of people came into interviews with Google and didn't know. So like standing out can be like really understanding a company in an industry and not reading from a script on like if they're a public company what their last earnings report was, but like really taking the time. Yeah, it might be a investment of 5 to 10 hours, but then you're going to go and stand out, right? Like against the rest of your peers.
Yeah, I think that taking that time, doing that homework is super important. So thank you for that. And question here, which is for people getting involved in finance, I'm guessing like right out of school, do you recommend applying to larger companies or smaller companies first? Can you like sort of weigh the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, I mean, the pro at a larger company is, a lot of these like financial systems and processes are in place, and you can learn best practice. Like to just go straight from school and go to like a small startup where they have nothing in place, like you won't even know what you're supposed to fix. So I don't think it's a bad thing to go to a larger company, which will also give you some optionality in like moving to a different segment or doing something different. And sometimes they'll have these structured rotational programs, which are kind of interesting. Going back to like, oh, what you wish you would have done, like that would have been pretty cool, I think, actually, if I, like when I graduated business school or undergrad, like gone into one of these like structured things where you get exposure to like marketing and finance and management and these other things. I think that's a kind of an interesting, because I do believe in like the, at least for myself, like the breadth versus the depth aspect. But at this, so I'd say for like your first job, if you want to see like how things, and not everything's perfect. Most of these big companies are also messes, but at least they're a little better than like a really early startup. That would be probably the way I would lean. And then you could always, a couple of years in, go, if you really were passionate about like a very early stage company, at least you'd have some context around what decent looks like. And there's gonna be no one to train you at a small company either, right? Like, it's gonna be like no one's gonna have any time, so.
Right. Ben, thanks so much for your time. I'm going to wrap up with one more question here, which is a more your career-based question. And that is, what is your career, what is your 10-year plan? The students curious about hearing sort of someone who's further along in their career, what your sort of next steps are.
Hopefully retire now. I'm just kidding. Again, like I know my plans will change. That was like kind of the theme of my my whole talk. I think why I went to Care instead of like a smaller startup. In theory, I wanted to gain some more experience at like a larger platform. And I think about my career as having like kind of like there's going to be a fork in the road at some point. So I'm either going to continue and look at like CFO roles and potentially at like larger companies. And that's kind of like the path Care could take me on. I think there's another path of like going back to a smaller company and helping grow that from like almost like a finance operational standpoint. And then there's potentially an entrepreneurial path of like doing something myself, or maybe going back to some kind of investing role. And I think everything I'm doing kind of like will lead me to that fork, and I'll be able to make that decision. And that's kind of how I'm, rather than like I must be the CFO of a public company. I don't want to put like a marker in the ground like that, because I've learned enough where that will change dramatically. But I want to make sure like I'm getting the right experience to kind of make that decision whenever it happens.
Awesome, Ben. Thanks so much for sharing this time in this presentation with the Xoogler School students. I know it was really, really insightful, and also good to hear sort of how you moved through different ups and downs in your career in sort of a topsy-turvy time for.
Yeah, everyone keep their heads up, and you guys will be all right.
Yeah, Ben, thanks so much. Looking forward to seeing what you get up into in the next couple of years.
Yeah, you can build an algorithmic trading model off of my career decisions if you like.
That'll be our next project. We'll we'll have our engineers on it, our software engineers on it. Yeah, so I think we're gonna wrap up now. And our next session today is at noon with JB Whitman talking about different careers in HR, and we're looking forward to seeing you all there. Ben, thanks again.
All right, thank you. Take care.